Hello. Hi. Welcome once again to the Style Made Simple by Grayson's channel, your one-stop fashion academy that enables you to cut out your outfits and sew without patterns. It's also a fashion tidbit and lifestyle channel. Straight into business, today we are going to sew a simple pencil skirt. And before we go do the cutting, I just want to share a few things with you. Now you need 1.5 yards of fabric. That should be enough for most figure sizes. You don't need too much. Since it's a pencil skirt, you don't need too much of fabric. Again, make sure the fabric you choose is firm to handle, and the fabric should be beginner friendly. For the first assignment, you don't need any slippery fabric. Now you're going to need a set of measurements. You're going to need your waist measurements, your hip measurements, your hip depth measurements, your skirt length measurements. Those are the measurements you're going to be needing for the skirt. Last but not the least, let's see how it goes. You should remember that the skirt will be two pieces. You're going to have the front piece and then the back piece. So we're going to cut two pieces, the front section and the back section. At the end of the day, when you're done cutting, you're going to be stitching the sides. So you're going to create a seam at the side. So the front piece will be cut with stitching allowance, and then the back piece will be also cut with stitching allowance. Now the back piece will come as two pieces because we're going to join and then attach a zip at the opening. And so that's what I want you to understand. So according to how we're going to cut the pieces, that's how we're going to break down the measurements. So for instance, if your hip is 40, then you should know that 20 of that 40 is coming for the front section of the skirt, and then 20 is also going to the back section of the skirt. If your waist is 30, 15 would be for the front section of the skirt, and then 15 will be for the back section of the skirt. So once you join at the side and side, you complete the measurements. So we are going to be breaking down the measurements, and then we'll use the broken down measurements to fold and cut. So we are going to use our quarter waist measurements to fold and our quarter hip measurements to fold. Let's go cut. Okay, so you're welcome to the second segment where we are going to do our cutting. And since we've already discussed how we're going to use the measurements, we are going straight away into the folding and the cutting process. So the first thing to do is to fold the fabric according to your quarter hip measurement plus your stitching allowance. Remember, for the skirt, the hip is the widest part of the body. The hip measurement is the biggest measurement we have there. So we are using a quarter of that, which is 10 to fold. Now after folding, you also need, apart from the 10, you also need extra fabric outside the 10 for seam allowance. And so you fold quarter hip plus 2, which will be 12. So this is 12 inches. So then the folded part of the fabric now becomes the center line. So we have one constructional line, the folded edge as the center line. Now we are going for our waistline. So you square across like this, and then this becomes your waistline. The next line to look for would be the hip line. Now how do we get the hip line? You use your hip depth measurement, which is 8. In this case, the measurement we are using is 8. And so you would now use your hip depth measurement, which is 8, to locate your hip line. So you have 8 inches here and then 8 inches here. You square across. So 3, center line, waistline, hip line. The last line we will need will be our hemline. And for the hemline, we are using the skirt length to get to the hem. So you use whichever length you want for your skirt to determine where the hem of the skirt will be. In this case, I am using 24 for the skirt length. So this is the 24. This is where the 24 ends. So you do the same thing and then square across. Okay, So now that we have our constructional lines ready, we can now bring the measurements into the work. Remember again, our center line, our waistline, our hip depth line or our hip line, and then our hemline. So straight away, let's work with the measurements. On the waistline, you are required to measure 1/4 of your waist, which is 7.5. 7.5. And remember, we are going to add an inch for that. So 7.5 plus an inch will give us 8.5. So you mark your 8.5. And then on the hip line, you measure your quarter hip, which is 10. So the 10 will get you to this point. And then on the hip line, on the hem line also, you need to apply the same measurements, which will be 10. But because it's a pencil skirt, the hem of the skirt has to be a bit narrow. So instead of using the same 10 inches here, let's get in a bit and use 9 for starters. We don't want it also too narrow where we can't even move our legs. So 9 inches here for the narrowing of the skirts. It means we deducted 1 inch from the quarter hip measurement. It was supposed to be 10 inches, 10 inches. That will give you a straight-sided skirt. But because we want it a pencil skirt, the hem is supposed to be narrow. So we've reduced this measurement here to 9 instead of 10. Remember that is only for pencil skirts. If it's an A-line skirt, then that's a different thing altogether. You rather shoot the measurements out. But for now, let's restrict ourselves to the pencil skirt. So now that we have our positions, we are going to connect the lines. Okay, now the first thing, if you have a curve like this, so you find an area of the curve that will connect the waist point to the hip with a slight curve. There you have it. And then you connect the points at the hem to the hip line with a straight line. So this is what we ended up having. Now we have the outline of the skirt. So you can see that all the fabric outside will cater for our seam allowance, extra allowance that we are going to be using. So now that we have the outline of the skirt, let's work on the dart. Remember, our dart interval was 3.5. The dart itself, that interval was 7, and since we are dividing it into 2, we're using 3.5. So you locate your 3.5 here. Now the size of the dart was 1 inch, and so we are splitting the 1 inch up into 2. You have your 3.5. So you put half an inch on the left hand side of the center of the dart, and then another half an inch on the right hand side of the center of the dart. Okay, now we want the length of the dart. The length of the dart averagely should be 5 inches. And so this is the length. So you check whether from here to the point you have marked is 3.5. So 3.5, 3.5, length of 5 inches, size of ½ inch on the left hand side or on the right, and then ½ inch on the other side. Now we are going to connect all these 3 points, 1, 2, 3, 4, with lines. So first of all, let's get the center line for the darts, and then ½ inch to the right, and then the other ½ inch to the other side. So there we have it. We have our darts ready. Okay, so now that we are done with the skirts, let's now add our allowances. For the front, before we add the allowances, let's take the front skirts in a bit. Because it's the front and we have, most of the times we have a bit of a protruding belly. We want the skirt to sit properly. And so you drop the skirt by ½ an inch at the center and then reconnect. Reconnect from the waist point down. So this becomes our new waistline. Now let's check out our seam allowances. We are adding 2 inches seam allowances throughout. So 2 inches 2 inches, 2 inches, 2 inches, and then 2 inches also for the hem. 2 inches, 2 inches, 2 inches. And so this outline is your basic skirt, and then the broken lines will be your seam allowances. The hem also has 2 inches, and then the waist will be half an inch because we are going to fit it into a band. So we have half an inch, half an inch, half an inch, and so you mark your seam allowances with broken lines. So there we have our skirts all drafted and nice and ready to cut. So we are going, like I said in my earlier video, you cut out with large strokes. Okay, so now that we've cut it out, let's trim the waist, the excess on the waist a bit. So there we have our skirts, all nicely cut out. And so we are now going to use this to cut out the back portion of the skirts. Okay, so we are all ready to cut out our back skirt now. And so we are going to fold the material as we did for the front, and then place our front piece on to be able to get the back. You don't have to go drafting the back all over again. Everything has been done on the front skirt. So once you place it onto the back fabric, you don't have to do any construction again. Please always try to avoid wastage. Fold only as much fabric as you would need. Now you realize that for placing the front skirt on the fabric for the back, I left a little bit of allowance at the edge here. This will cater for fixing the zip. Okay, we'll cut the back piece into 2 and then join again up to a certain point, and then attach a zip to the end. So you always leave an extra allowance as opening so you can attach a zip. So you realize that I've placed the fabric on the front piece on the fabric. I have left extra allowance here for zip. That's the only allowance I'm going to leave. I'm going to cut the rest of the work just according to what I have for the front. So normally you can cut out the big piece first, cut out the extra piece first, so that you can handle the fabric well. So now that this big piece is out of the way, I can really cut the skirt out. So for the back piece, I'm cutting a straight waistline. I'm not curving the waist in as I did to the front. I'm keeping it straight. Apart from that, all other things remain the same. So now I'm cutting the side seam. So I cut out the side seam, and then I also cut out the hem. I also trim the hem. So trimming the hem. Okay, so now that we are done with cutting the skirt, the only thing left is to cut out a band, and the size we're using for the band would be 1 inch. And so we're going to fold 1.5 inches. Always 1 inch for the actual size of the band, an extra ½ inch for seam allowance. So you fold it into 2 like this and make sure it is up to 1.5. If you want a bigger band as you want it, you cut it according to your size, but I am using 1.5. For now, big bands are not so popular. Some even sew their skirts without bands, but because it's a tuition, you want to learn how to fix a band correctly. So 1.5, and then you cut through. And so that's it. We have our band. We're going to apply our stiffening interfacing to it and then attach it onto the skirt. Okay, so now that we are done with our skirt, before we start the sewing process, let's go over briefly once again. We have a front portion that has been cut out. We place the front portion on the back. We've cut out the back. Remember, I forgot to mention that the seam allowance for the zip extension for the back is 1 or 1.5 inches, depending on how you want it, but it shouldn't exceed 2 inches. So that's it. Before we start our sewing process, let's now notch our key points. So we are going to notch our darts for the front. You notch, so once you go to the pressing table, you know exactly where to fold to get your dart. So I've notched for the front. I'm notching at the same position for the back. I'm notching my seam allowance, my stitching line. So this, where I have notched, I'm going to stitch along this line. This will be my stitching line, and this will be, once I stitch, I create a seam. So this is the seam allowance, the allowance, extra allowance that will be left inside the dress. Okay, so now I'm going to divide the back portion into 2, because like I said, we're going to join again and then attach a zip before we fit in a band. And so I'm going to notch where the allowance starts and ends. Okay, oops, I notched it too big. The knot shouldn't be too big, it should be just a little cut. Okay, so this is my extra allowance for zip. And then to keep it safe, you can also notch the hem to show that this is where you're going to turn over the hem when you are ready to finish the raw edge. But it's not a hard and fast rule. You can always recheck with your tape to determine where your 24 inches ends. So this is it. We are done with our skirts.